For centuries, we thought we knew where the Gullah Geechee came from. We built narratives around Sierra Leone, around Rice Coast traders, around a people frozen in time. But DNA has just blown that story wide open. And what scientists are discovering in their genetic code is forcing us to completely rewrite the history of African America. The Gullah Geechee are among the most culturally distinctive African American populations in the United States. Living along the Sea Islands that stretch from North Carolina down through South Carolina, Georgia, and into Florida, they have maintained a unique cultural identity, a Creole language, and traditions that harken back directly to Africa. For generations, this isolation has been both their protection and their definition. Geographically separated from the mainland, these communities preserved African customs, religious practices, foodways, and most notably, a language that outsiders could barely understand. The Gullah language itself became the primary evidence that historians and linguists pointed to when constructing the narrative of Gullah origins. The Sea Islands themselves played a crucial role in Gullah cultural preservation. These barrier islands, separated from the mainland by marshes and waterways, created natural barriers that limited contact with mainland American culture. The islands include places like St. Helena Island, Hilton Head Island, and dozens of smaller islands along the Carolina and Georgia coasts. The landscape was beautiful but challenging, hot and humid, prone to diseases like malaria that devastated European populations, while people of African descent had somewhat greater resistance due to genetic adaptations. This demographic reality meant that on Sea Island plantations, the ratio of enslaved Africans to European overseers was even more skewed than on mainland plantations. In some cases, Africans outnumbered Europeans by ratios exceeding 30-1. This extraordinary demographic imbalance created space for African cultural practices to flourish in ways that were not possible elsewhere. That narrative was remarkably consistent. The story went like this. The Gullah Geechee were primarily descendants of people from Sierra Leone and the surrounding regions known as the African Rice Coast. The linguistic evidence seemed to support this. Scholars noted striking similarities between Gullah and Creole, the Creole language spoken in Sierra Leone. Sea Islanders could understand Creole speakers and vice versa. Beyond language, cultural connections were apparent everywhere. Rice growing techniques matched those of West African farmers. The quilting patterns echoed African aesthetics. Songs and stories carried African rhythms and narratives. The name Gullah itself was believed to derive from Gola, referring to people from Angola, though the Sierra Leone connection seemed more prominent in the cultural record. This story was taught in classrooms, written into academic papers, and became the accepted understanding of who the Gullah Geechee were. But there was always something incomplete about this narrative. Historians knew it. They understood that the transatlantic slave trade was complex, that Charleston, South Carolina had become the largest slave port in North America, that approximately 40% of all enslaved Africans brought to British North America passed through Charleston's docks. The trade records were detailed. They documented where ships originated, what regions were being targeted, what the demographic breakdown looked like. According to the documented legal slave trade into Charleston, approximately 39% of enslaved Africans came from West Central Africa, which includes present-day Angola, Congo, and parts of Gabon. 20% came from Senegambia, representing present-day Senegal and Gambia. 17% came from the Windward Coast, modern-day Ivory Coast, and Liberia. 13% originated from the Gold Coast, today's Ghana. Only 6% came from Sierra Leone itself, and 5% from the bights of Benin and Biafra, encompassing parts of modern Nigeria, Cameroon, Togo, and Benin. These numbers told a different story than the cultural narrative suggested. West Central Africa appeared far more prominently in the historical record than Sierra Leone did. Yet the cultural evidence seemed to point elsewhere. This tension between the historical documents and the cultural preservation had never been fully resolved. Researchers understood that autosomal DNA analysis would eventually clarify the question, but such comprehensive genetic studies of the Gullah Geechee population had been limited. The field of African American genomics has itself had a complicated history in Western science, marked by ethical concerns, representation gaps, and the need for community engagement and consent. That is changing now. Recent genetic research is finally providing the clarity that historians and anthropologists have long sought, and the results are surprising in ways that challenge the prevailing narrative, while simultaneously confirming what the historical trade documents suggested all along. The most recent and comprehensive study, published in December of 2025, examined mitochondrial DNA from 189 participants, 79 of whom identified as Gullah Geechee, and 110 who identified as African American from other regions. The research was conducted across multiple institutions and represents the most detailed genetic analysis of Gullah Geechee maternal lineage to date. The findings are significant and complex. When researchers analyzed the mitochondrial DNA haplogroups, they found that L2 and L3 haplogroups were by far the most frequent in both populations. Among African Americans generally, L2 comprised 34.6% and L3 comprised 38.8% of the sample. Among Gullah Geechee specifically, L2 comprised 28% and L3 comprised 54.7%. What makes this particularly striking is what was absent. Non-L haplogroups, which are associated with European and Native American ancestry, appeared in less than 2% of the Gullah Geechee sample. In contrast, these same non-L haplogroups appeared in approximately 2% of the general African American sample as well, but they were present. This indicates that Gullah Geechee populations experience significantly less genetic admixture with European and Native American populations compared to other African American groups. This makes biological sense given their geographic isolation and the demographic composition of the Sea Islands, where African enslaved people vastly outnumbered Europeans. On many plantations and coastal areas, the ratio of Africans to Europeans was extraordinarily skewed, sometimes reaching 20 to 1 or even higher. This demographic reality meant that African cultural and genetic heritage was more likely to persist and dominate in these communities. But the broader genetic analysis reveals something even more important about the origins question. Recent whole genome studies of Gullah Geechee populations demonstrate that they have predominantly West and West Central African genomic ancestry. The key word here is West Central. Multiple independent genetic studies confirm this finding. The Gullah Geechee show strong genetic affiliation with populations from West Central Africa, including Angola, Congo, and surrounding regions. They also show genetic connections to other West African populations, but the West Central African connection is particularly pronounced in the autosomal DNA data. This genetic finding aligns far more closely with the historical slave trade records than with the cultural narrative that had become dominant. The documents, it turns out, were telling the truth all along. West Central Africa was indeed the primary source region for Gullah Geechee ancestors. The trade records had correctly documented that nearly 40% of enslaved Africans arriving in Charleston came from West Central Africa, and now the DNA confirms this. The genetic ancestry of the Gullah Geechee reflects this historical reality in their very cellular makeup. This raises an important question. If the genetic data confirms West Central African origins as the primary ancestry, why did the cultural narrative become so focused on Sierra Leone? Part of the answer lies in the nature of cultural preservation and the ways that linguistic evidence can sometimes mislead us. While approximately 25% of Gullah language does show similarities to Creole from Sierra Leone, this does not mean that 25% of Gullah ancestry is from Sierra Leone. Other linguistic elements tell a different story. Gullah counting systems can be traced to the Fula people of Guinea. Songs in the Gullah tradition can be traced to the Mende ethnic group. The name Gullah itself derives from Gola, referencing Angolans. When you look at the full linguistic picture rather than focusing solely on the Creole connection, a more complex and diverse African heritage emerges. Furthermore, linguists now understand that Gullah and Creole are not necessarily derived from one another. Rather, both languages may share a closer common origin. Both emerged from the complex multilingual environment of the Atlantic world, where traders, enslaved people, and sailors of different African origins needed to communicate. Creole in Sierra Leone and Gullah in the Sea Islands could have developed in parallel fashion from similar linguistic substrates, and the need for intergroup communication in situations of displacement and forced cohabitation. The linguistic similarity that seemed so conclusive actually reflects something more subtle: the shared communication challenges of the Atlantic slave trade and the common African linguistic roots that both populations brought with them. The genetic research also reveals something crucial about how the Gullah Geechee relate to other African Americans across the United States. Statistical analysis of the genetic data shows no significant difference between the maternal ancestry of Gullah Geechee populations and other African Americans. This suggests that Gullah Geechee lineages may represent a founding biocultural population for African Americans more broadly. In other words, the genetic diversity you see in African American populations across the country may well trace back to populations like the Gullah Geechee. The Gullah Geechee preserved certain African heritage elements more distinctly, but they share fundamental ancestry with African Americans everywhere. This finding has profound implications. It suggests that African American genetic ancestry is fundamentally West and West Central African in origin. The diversity and complexity you see in contemporary African American genetic profiles reflects not just different African source regions, but also the specific historical circumstances of the transatlantic slave trade and the subsequent mixing that occurred in various parts of North America. The Gullah Geechee, preserved by geography and maintained with less European admixture, may serve as a kind of genetic anchor point for understanding the broader African American experience. One of the most important insights from contemporary genetic research is that individual African American mtDNA samples often match mtDNA haplotypes found in multiple African ethnic groups, rather than in a single ethnic group. Studies examining African American mitochondrial DNA have found that more than half of sampled HVSI mtDNA haplotypes exactly match common haplotypes shared among multiple African ethnic groups. Another 40% did not match any sequence in existing African databases, reflecting the limitations of current African genetic databases. Fewer than 10% were exact matches to a sequence from a single African ethnic group. This has a crucial implication. You cannot simply look at a genetic haplotype and say with certainty that it comes from one particular African ethnic group. The haplotypes spread across populations. They mix and match. They appear in different combinations in different regions. This means that genetic ancestry, while incredibly valuable, must be understood within a larger historical and cultural context. When a DNA test tells someone they have West African ancestry, it is providing accurate information, but it is not pinpointing a specific ethnic group or a specific village or a specific ancestral tradition. It is providing a regional signal. This is a humbling lesson for genealogists and ancestry researchers. DNA science is powerful, but it has limits. It can tell you a geographic region of ancestry with reasonable accuracy. It can connect you to genetic relatives across generations. But it cannot replace the detailed work of genealogical research, historical documents, census records, and family oral history. The most complete ancestry picture comes from combining all these sources of information, allowing each to illuminate what the others cannot fully explain. The mitochondrial DNA studies show that Gullah Geechee maternal ancestry is more likely to match haplotypes found in West or West Central African populations than in Eastern or Southern African populations. This geographic specificity is meaningful. It tells us something real about where Gullah Geechee maternal ancestors came from. But it also reminds us that the African continent contained hundreds of distinct ethnic groups, kingdoms, linguistic communities, and cultural traditions. When enslaved Africans arrived in the Americas, they came from this extraordinary diversity. They came speaking different languages, practicing different religions, maintaining different kinship systems, holding different technologies and knowledge traditions. The transatlantic slave trade forced people from this diverse African world into new environments where they had to adapt, resist, and create new cultural forms. The Gullah Geechee represent one of the most successful examples of African cultural preservation in North America. How did this happen? Several factors converged. Geographic isolation on the Sea Islands meant that Gullah communities were somewhat removed from the intensity of cultural assimilation pressure that African Americans faced in more densely populated areas. The labor system on rice plantations was brutal and deadly, but it also created demographic conditions where enslaved Africans vastly outnumbered Europeans. In these circumstances, African cultural practices had space to persist and develop. The development of the Gullah language itself represents this dynamic. New arrivals from Africa, speaking dozens of different African languages, needed to communicate with one another and with European overseers and traders. Gullah emerged as a Creole language that incorporated African linguistic features, especially from Bantu languages and languages of the Upper Guinea region, combined with English vocabulary and simplified grammatical structures. Over generations, Gullah became the native language of people born in the Sea Islands, a language that incorporated African heritage while being distinctly American. The cultural practices that persisted also reflect this creative adaptation. Gullah foodways combine African cooking techniques and ingredients with New World crops and European influences, creating something new while maintaining African sensibilities about community, family, and the spiritual significance of food. Gullah music, whether in secular or spiritual contexts, retains African rhythmic patterns and call and response structures. Gullah spiritual practices, though influenced by Christianity, incorporated African religious concepts and maintained African ways of honoring ancestors and engaging with the spiritual world. The material culture of the Gullah Geechee, from baskets to quilts to house construction, reflects African aesthetic principles adapted to new materials and new circumstances. Now, contemporary genetic research is adding another layer to our understanding of the Gullah Geechee. The DNA evidence confirms that their African ancestry is real and deep. It also confirms that the geographic source of that ancestry is primarily West and West Central Africa, with the strongest genetic signals pointing toward Angola, Congo, and surrounding regions, exactly as the historical trade records documented. The slight genetic connection to Sierra Leone that researchers have identified is real, but far smaller than the cultural narrative had suggested. This is not to diminish the Sierra Leone connection. 25% of Gullah language reflecting Creole similarity is still significant. The historical connections between Sierra Leone and the Sea Islands are documented and real, but they represent one thread in a much more complex tapestry of African heritage. What this means for individuals tracing Gullah Geechee ancestry through DNA testing is important to understand. When someone takes a DNA test and receives results indicating West African or West Central African ancestry, they are receiving accurate information, but that information must be placed within a larger historical, cultural, and genealogical context. DNA testing can confirm regional African ancestry. It can provide maternal or paternal lineage information that traces back generations. It can connect people to genetic relatives who share common ancestry. But it cannot tell you which specific African village your ancestor came from. It cannot pinpoint the exact ethnic group. It cannot explain the cultural traditions your family maintained. Those stories come from oral history, from genealogical records, from cultural knowledge, from family memory. Over 1 million people in the United States may have ancestral ties to the Gullah Geechee community, though many have no idea. This reflects both the Great Migration that occurred between 1919 and 1970, when African Americans fled the Jim Crow South seeking opportunities in northern and western cities, and the broader reality that Gullah Geechee ancestry is not confined to the Sea Islands anymore. Descendants live everywhere. They may not speak Gullah. They may not practice traditional Gullah foodways or maintain Gullah spiritual practices, but they carry Gullah ancestry in their DNA and in their family trees. For many of these people, discovering a Gullah Geechee connection through genealogical research and DNA testing becomes a profound moment of reconnection with a heritage they did not know they possessed. The contemporary research on Gullah Geechee genetics serves several important functions. First, it contributes to our understanding of African American genetic diversity and the historical processes that shaped it. Second, it provides individuals with accurate information about their own ancestry, helping people connect with roots they may have lost or never known. Third, it represents a significant step forward in the inclusion of African-descended populations in genomic research. For far too long, genetic research focused primarily on European and Asian populations, creating reference databases that were skewed and incomplete. Increasing research on African and African American populations helps create more accurate and representative genetic databases. This has implications not just for ancestry research, but for medical genetics and health disparities research as well. Fourth, the research on Gullah Geechee genetics demonstrates the importance of community-engaged research. The recent studies were conducted with the participation and consent of Gullah Geechee individuals and communities. The Gullah Society, founded to preserve Gullah history and traditions, has partnered with geneticists to conduct this research in ethical ways that respect community interests and autonomy. This represents a significant shift from earlier periods when genetic research on African Americans was conducted without consent or community benefit. Today, the ethical standard requires that communities participate in research decisions and benefit from the knowledge that research generates. The discovery that Gullah Geechee ancestors came primarily from West Central Africa, particularly Angola and Congo, opens new possibilities for understanding these communities and their connections to contemporary African nations. Some Gullah Geechee have traveled to Angola and other West Central African nations to trace their roots and connect with contemporary African populations. These journeys of reconnection are emotionally powerful and symbolically significant, though they must be approached with understanding that contemporary Angolans and Congolese are not direct continuations of the people who were enslaved centuries ago. Nations change, populations move, cultures evolve. The connection is real but historical, not a simple matter of contemporary identity. What emerges from all this research is a portrait of the Gullah Geechee that is more complex and more grounded in historical reality than the earlier narratives suggested. The Gullah Geechee are indeed an African people who maintained African heritage in remarkable ways. Their ancestry is primarily West and West Central African, with the strongest genetic signals pointing toward Angola and Congo. Their language incorporates African linguistic features from multiple African sources, not just Sierra Leone. Their cultural practices reflect African principles adapted and transformed in the Americas. Their history is one of resilience in the face of extraordinary brutality and oppression. And they represent a kind of genetic and cultural anchor point that helps us understand the broader African American experience. The DNA findings do not diminish the Gullah Geechee achievement. Rather, they deepen our appreciation for what these communities accomplished. Despite being torn from multiple African homelands and forced into conditions of enslavement, Gullah Geechee ancestors maintained African languages, cultural practices, spiritual traditions, and family structures. They created something new while honoring something old. They developed a Creole language that combined African and European linguistic elements into something distinctly their own. They maintained African foodways, music, religious practices, and aesthetic sensibilities. They passed these traditions to their children across generations. The geographic isolation of the Sea Islands and the demographic realities of rice plantation slavery created space for this preservation to occur in ways that were less possible in other places. Now, DNA research provides biological confirmation of what cultural historians and anthropologists had long understood. The Gullah Geechee are genuinely African in their ancestry, and their African heritage runs deep. The specific African origins that DNA reveals, West and West Central Africa, rather than primarily Sierra Leone, align with historical trade documentation, while requiring us to revise some cultural narratives. This is not a contradiction, but a complexity. Cultures are dynamic. They incorporate influences from multiple sources. The Gullah language reflects not just the genetic ancestry of Gullah Geechee people, but also the particular historical circumstances of their emergence. The diverse African languages that merged to create Gullah, the English language they encountered, and the complex multilingual world of the Atlantic slave trade and its aftermath. The implications of this research extend beyond the Gullah Geechee themselves. Understanding Gullah Geechee ancestry helps us understand African American ancestry more broadly. It suggests that West and West Central Africa were primary source regions for African American populations generally, though African Americans also have ancestry from West African regions, including Senegambia, the Windward Coast, the Gold Coast, and smaller contributions from other African regions. It confirms the profound historical importance of Charleston as the primary slave port through which African ancestry entered British North America and later the United States. It demonstrates how historical trade documentation and genetic evidence can be triangulated to understand the past more clearly. And it shows how cultural preservation, though often incomplete and changed through the centuries, can maintain connections to ancestral homelands and traditions even when the specific ethnic and regional origins become somewhat obscured by time and distance. For researchers and genealogists, the contemporary genetic data on Gullah Geechee populations represents a resource for understanding broader patterns of African American ancestry. For individuals seeking to trace their own ancestry, Gullah Geechee research provides a model for how DNA testing, genealogical research, historical documents, and cultural knowledge can be combined to create a richer and more accurate understanding of family history. For cultural historians and anthropologists, the research highlights the importance of recognizing both continuity and change, of understanding how African cultural practices were maintained and adapted in the Americas, and of appreciating the agency and creativity that enslaved and formerly enslaved people demonstrated in maintaining their humanity and their connections to ancestral traditions, even under conditions of profound oppression. The story of the Gullah Geechee is ultimately a story about resilience, creativity, and cultural persistence. It is a story about people torn from African homelands, forced into conditions of slavery, and managing nonetheless to maintain and transmit African heritage to subsequent generations. It is a story about the development of new cultural forms like the Gullah language that emerged from the confrontation of multiple African languages and the English language in a colonial context. It is a story about geographic isolation providing a kind of refuge where cultural preservation was more possible. And it is a story that contemporary DNA research helps us understand more fully and more accurately. The revelation that Gullah Geechee ancestry is more West Central African than the cultural narrative suggested does not diminish this achievement. If anything, it reminds us that African heritage is not monolithic. West Central African cultures, languages, spiritual traditions, and knowledge systems were brought to the Sea Islands by enslaved Africans from Angola, Congo, and surrounding regions. These cultures merge with other African traditions, brought by people from Senegambia, the Windward Coast, the Gold Coast, and other regions, to create something new and distinctly Gullah. Understanding this complexity better enriches our appreciation for what the Gullah Geechee accomplished and continues to accomplish in preserving African heritage in the Americas. For generations to come, the Gullah Geechee will continue to serve as a living laboratory for understanding African American history, genetics, and culture. The Gullah language continues to evolve while maintaining connections to its African roots. Gullah cultural practices continue to be transmitted through families and communities. The Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor stretches along the Sea Islands from North Carolina to Florida, preserving historic sites and providing spaces for education and cultural tourism. Younger generations of Gullah Geechee people are increasingly using DNA testing and genealogical research to trace their ancestry and connect with their heritage. And scholars continue to study the Gullah Geechee to understand the complex processes of cultural change, preservation, and adaptation that characterize the African diaspora. The DNA evidence showing that Gullah Geechee ancestors came primarily from West and West Central Africa does not erase the Sierra Leone connections that remain culturally significant. Rather, it places those connections within a larger context. The 25% of Gullah language that reflects Creole similarities is meaningful. The cultural traditions that echo Sierra Leone practices are significant, but they must be understood as one part of a larger whole that also includes substantial contributions from Angola, Congo, Senegambia, the Gold Coast, and other African regions. This fuller, more complex picture of Gullah Geechee origins reflects the reality of the Atlantic slave trade, which drew enslaved people from multiple African regions and forced them together into new communities where they created new cultures while maintaining connections to ancestral traditions. The story of the Gullah Geechee, as revealed by contemporary DNA research, is finally one of accuracy and honesty about history. For centuries, we thought we knew where they came from. We were partially right, but we were also partially wrong. DNA has given us the tools to understand more fully and more precisely what the historical records suggested all along. West and West Central. Africa were the primary ancestral homelands of the Gullah Geechee, but alongside this primary ancestry ran smaller but significant threads connecting them to other African regions. And threading through all of this was the remarkable human achievement of creating and maintaining African cultures and traditions in circumstances of enslavement and oppression. That is the story that DNA reveals. That is the truth that genetic science helps us understand more clearly than ever before.